welcome back to another episode of the Emerging Market Entrepreneur, a new show where we talk about things that impact startup entrepreneurs, CEOs, and founders of new businesses. We are going to do a deep dive into the things that impact us as a result of the COVID-19 situation. Today, we will talk about variable costs and deep dive into what are some of the things that you can do to keep your business afloat. As always, I have with me Alex Neeps, the founder of Printulu, and Kyle Torrington, the founder and CEO of Legal Legends and Hello Contracts. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sid. Hi, Sid. Yeah, thank you for having us. Thank you, Kyle, for joining in on helping other entrepreneurs, maneuvering through these difficult times from a legal perspective. And yeah, this episode is going to be again how to create liquidity, and it would be great if you could help our fellow entrepreneurs on how to generate liquidity, obviously in a legal way. That's why we have you here on board.
Perfect. Happy to do so, guys, and great to be here, and hello to your listeners.
Great. Sid, should we directly jump in, or
yeah, absolutely.
Anything else you want to get our listeners to know?
I don't know. Maybe we should do a quick checkup to see how everybody's doing. Are we keeping safe? Are we social distancing? Alex, you seem to be in isolation right now. You're probably locked in a somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, here on my side, everything is fine. Social distancing at its best, getting a bit lonely, but hey, the business is keeping me busy, so it's fine.
Yeah, same here. Also been isolating for the last 6 or so weeks, only going out to shop and occasionally walk my dogs within 5 k's of my house. But yeah, it is getting a bit frustrating, but unfortunately we've got no choice at this point.
Well, the more we stay in isolation right now, the better it'll be to flatten the curve and make sure we get back up and running sooner rather than later. So let's jump right in. Today, Alex, we're going to be talking a little bit about variable costs. Let's go back to your business for a second. We know that you're in the printing industry, so variable costs, what does that entail? Ink, paper?
Yeah, I mean, variable costs generally for businesses, last week we talked about fixed costs, and variable costs basically are the costs in your business that change with your revenue. So when you sell one unit, then basically your costs go up more or less proportionally. And this is what you normally define as variable costs. This is in particular now very important for businesses that have generally favorable payment terms and very low operating leverage. That's when you now really have to focus on your variable costs.
Okay, fantastic. So
also in these times, I think now companies are in as better position as they've ever been at being able to potentially transfer certain fixed costs into variable costs, negotiating with suppliers where they would otherwise have had a minimum, whatever it might be, payment per month, to something more variable related purely because of the lockdown and the uncertainty in the business environment. So it's a great opportunity for that as well.
100%. I 100% agree. So let's look at when looking at variable costs. I mean, we basically do the same thing as we did with fixed costs. So the main thing we should look at is what are our main variable costs. It doesn't make sense now to look necessarily at energy costs and now go and try to negotiate with Eskom. So the things that we should kind of focus on, in my opinion, is what are your main variable costs. So for me, it might be paper costs, or it might be plate cost or click cost for digital printing, or whatever it might be. And then really go in and say, okay, where do I have the payment terms? Where is my cash flow going to be hit hardest now, end of May? And what are the things that I should what are the costs that I should actually look at? The other thing I generally look at is the relationship to the suppliers, and what is the likely outcome of how a supplier is going to look at. So there are a couple of factors, in my opinion, that really need to be taken for granted and need to be taken into account when looking and negotiating with other suppliers.
I think also,
yeah.
Sorry, from perspective, I always go back to the contract. The contract is always your governing document to determine how willing objectively a supplier would be in negotiating with you. For example, if you've got a years-long contract without any prospect of negotiation, the chances of them coming to the party, apart from sympathy, are fairly slim. But if you've got a month-to-month contract, you know quite easily that negotiating will be very easy in a sense. If they're not willing to come to the party, you can simply terminate the contract and go, well, listen, now let's renegotiate. So a lot of it, I would always advise my clients specifically, is go back to your contract. Let that be the basis of how you determine how to negotiate, and then take things from there.
So this is why you generally see vendors preferring to sign up their customers for long-term contracts, because they can then count on that annuity sort of income. Alex, you mentioned something about a trade-off between fixed and variable. Let's look at an example from last week. We spoke about rent. Now, rent is generally a fixed cost. You have to pay the same amount. You've got a long-term lease agreement. But in the age of the WeWorks and work from home environment, would you say that you could actually trade off something like rent for being a fixed cost and make it variable and just increase your office space as required when you're using these virtual environments?
I think you 100% can. I think, again, then it depends on what are the pros and cons to that. So definitely your pro is you're making it a variable cost, but most likely you're going to pay more. So in times where your revenue drops suddenly, obviously the variable cost is advisable, but generally the advantage of fixed costs is that, when you scale up, your fixed costs stay fixed. And so they maybe jump once you reach certain ceilings, but they generally don't go and increase proportionally to your revenue. So that's something I think every business needs to consider when now making these decisions. And it also depends on the cash position of each individual company, I would say.
Just to jump on that point, specifically with regard to rent and leases, converting them from fixed costs to variable costs. I wrote a blog article a few weeks ago on commercial leases and whether you actually obliged as a commercial lease tenant, whether you're in for a 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year lease, to actually pay your rent in the event of a lockdown. So, for example, in terms of a lease, you're meant to be provided with full use and enjoyment of the premises. To the extent that a landlord can't provide you with that because of a superior force, they call it a causus fortuitus in Latin, in theory, it would be against public policy to force you to continue to pay your rent. So that would be a great mechanism, or at least a point of departure in which to try and negotiate with your landlord. The reality is it's easier said than done. That's the theory. Landlords are very hard pressed to allow that, and the only way you're going to force them to permit that is through court proceedings, which is just in 99% of the cases not worth it. But that is the theory, and a good way to approach negotiations with the landlord.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Great insight. So, Alex, you mentioned pay-per-click and marketing. Let's talk about marketing as a variable cost, because this is something that you are in complete control of. You can spend more when you need to and spend less when you do not need to. I know from your business, you spend a lot of money marketing online through Google AdWords or Facebook. So how can you keep your defensive position in the marketplace and keep your messaging going when you have no revenue coming in? And what are the benefits of keeping that messaging going, particularly when you're not being able to service your clients?
Yeah, so I mean, this really depends on the business, right? If you are right now in some sort of essential services business, I mean, I would go all in, because everyone kind of is not able to buy stuff except from you. So I would go absolutely all in from whatever angle I can. Your conversion rates are most likely going to skyrocket, and I would absolutely go all in. For all other businesses, I mean, it depends. There is no recipe for that, in my opinion. I think number one is to secure your liquidity, to be able to sustain your business for the next 1 month on lockdown, 2 months on lockdown, or potentially even 3 months on lockdown. Because from what we're hearing from the government, it seems like they're expecting the peak to come only in between Q3 and Q4 of this year. So you need to just build some contingencies into your liquidity and cash flow planning. But once this is kind of done, I think that's when I would go and really look at, okay, what can I do in terms of my brand? And I think then it's really important to kind of get that competitive edge over your competitors, to stay top of mind.
What we did initially for the first couple of weeks of lockdown, when revenue did drop somewhat, we switched from our Google Ads spend to traditional email marketing, obviously free of charge, to get those mails out, to try engage with your existing clientele. So that was our way of coping with that the first couple of weeks, which I think it does rely on you having built a good base from the get-go, of having a solid client base of emails to send out to. So I think it's good to always have that, build that customer base that you can email market to.
100%. I think here the main thing is you look at your conversion rates, and then depending on that, spend money on marketing or not. If not, spend things on that's going to work for you long term, and that means content, email marketing, and build the relationship with your clients in whatever way you can.
Yeah. Alex, I'm glad you mentioned content. Kyle, you spoke about a blog post that you wrote earlier. What are some of the things that you can do that doesn't cost anything, and in the arena of email marketing or writing blog posts and getting to your consumers that way?
Yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time, especially on Hello Contract, in writing relevant blogs, educating people about what needs to be encompassed in, for example, a sale of shares agreement. So guys are really, really educated, become a leader in your specific industry through blog posts. But obviously, once again, it does lead somewhat into fixed costs, and that in order for your blogs to be seen, you've got to have decent SEO rankings. So you've at least got to have groundwork in place for your blog to be relevant and for it to be viewable. But if you connect that though through email and send out newsletters to your clientele, which then link to a blog post, obviously you wouldn't have had to have your SEO had to have much SEO done on your sites at all. But generally that's what we've tried to do, is just put out relevant content, which is free, and really, really educate the consumer from a point of view where it's relevant topics, search topics, but from a different angle, and trying to not repeat the same content that is out there hundreds of times over. For example, we just did a blog post which was released yesterday and I don't think I've ever seen many on the internet. The clauses in your contract called boilerplate clauses, they're all the common clauses that appear in every single contract, but no real customer has any idea of what they're about and why they're in there. So we just went in and decided to expand, well, what are the significance and importance behind these common clauses that everybody sees, but nobody really sort of takes a second look at. So relevance, but a slightly different angle in that relevance.
So there's a very interesting boilerplate clause that I've seen in agreements from for pretty much every agreement we've ever seen, and that is the elusive force majeure. I know you've spoken about this earlier, but can you maybe tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about force majeure, and how does that play into negotiations with suppliers and vendors and things like that?
So it's great for suppliers, provided you have the clause in your contract. The first thing to remember is that you can't impose force majeure unless you have a force majeure clause. Some contracts have it, some contracts don't. Sometimes when you're drafting, it's in your interest to include one. Sometimes it's not. So you have to have it from the get-go in your contract. Then what it normally says is that if there's any intervening event that is beyond the reasonable control of either of the parties, whether it be epidemic in this instance, government action, lockdown, or anything beyond the reasonable control of one or both of the parties, that party or both of the parties can impose an event of force majeure, meaning that their obligations in terms of the contract will be suspended for the duration of this force majeure event. Or what it normally goes on to say is, well, if that event continues for longer than, say, 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, then either party may terminate without any penalty. So it'd be great to use to negotiate with suppliers, especially if you first of all imposed an event of force majeure. You said to your suppliers, listen, it's impossible for me to perform. You could impose it. Then you could potentially look at some other avenue to negotiate a different relationship where something to the supplier is better than nothing. And it can be used as a good avenue for that. But you've got to be careful, because you can't all of a sudden start negotiating where it seems that you are able to, in fact, perform to some extent. So then why are you imposing the force majeure? So it's quite a thin tightrope that you do walk there, if that makes sense.
So Kyle, in that instance, it doesn't really matter whether it's fixed costs or variable costs. It's just a contract with any type of supplier, right?
Contract with any type of supplier that has the force majeure clause in, absolutely.
But Sid, here, I normally take the stand that I normally try to stick away from contracts. So Kyle, obviously, from a lawyer's perspective, he always says, you know, your basis is the contract. For me, it's the relationship with the suppliers. Isn't that the same for you?
No, that's absolutely correct. You spend a lot of time drafting a contract and you spend a lot of time negotiating it, but at the end of the day, it just sits in a dark drawer somewhere and you hope that you don't have to pull it out again. So
exactly.
I tend to agree.
For me, it's just the kind of last resort. And oftentimes with suppliers, you don't even have a well drafted a contract, especially, if you're dealing with other SMEs. You often don't have a contract, and then it becomes a little bit more difficult, Kyle, to actually rely on those contracts that do not exist.
So I'm not hearing any of this. As your lawyer, Alex, I refuse to hear any of this nonsense about
let's come back to that for a second. As an SME, we all know legal fees are very expensive, but then Kyle, you do a lot of work for companies like Alex's, for startups. You help them create a legal framework for them to operate in. I would tend to agree with you. We should always guard against getting into any commercial relationship without a contract governing it. If in the event that you do not have a contract, what are some of the things that still become legally binding?
First of all, this avenue I think is great to maybe look at what we've designed on the side, which is called Hello Contract. So it's designed for every entrepreneur that can't afford ordinary lawyers' fees. So it's super simple, cheap mechanism to automatically create contracts. Under the side, select a couple of questions and it pulls in and pulls out clause and inserts different variables, etc. So it custom crafts a contract around you. That is, I think, and sorry, I don't mean to plug a brand in here. It's just a good way.
Well, that's why we're here.
All right. Okay, cool. So Hello Contract, www.hellocontract.co.za is where you can go for it. So without having a contract in place, then you fall back on the common law. If you aren't able to afford anything, whether it be a template or ordinary lawyers. So I'd say your different stages of approach would be, if you can afford an ordinary lawyer, go to them. That'll always be your best approach. Secondly, if you can't afford that, look at automated contract platforms such as Hello Contract. Thirdly, if you can't afford that, it'll probably be the same price as template agreements. Potentially look at that, but make sure you go through your templates properly to ensure that they are in accordance with your actual intentions. Then finally, if you can't do any of that, or if you're far too lazy like Alex and relying on suppliers relationships, then you fall back on the common law and what's called delictual law, effectively. So, and it becomes very murky then, because there are a lot of aspects and a lot of things that come up in a relationship where it's just murky. Whose responsibility is it at a particular point when something was being delivered but not in the possession of both parties, for example? Is that your responsibility? Is that your supplier? Is that the courier? So it becomes very, very murky. It really does.
100%. I agree. But before we go always the contract route, I think every entrepreneur is trying to kind of have a chat with the supplier and trying to find common grounds. Sid, what are the two ways kind of thing to chat to suppliers about? I mean, what are the two things you would talk to them about?
Well, the first is trying to reason with them. I would say, if a supplier has enough clout over you and they're large enough creditor, they could force you into a liquidity issue. Now that doesn't benefit anybody because largely supplier accounts are unsecured credit. So it's in nobody's best interest for me to stop trading. And I think that in itself becomes incentive. So let me phrase that a bit differently. I would say it is the promise of future business and future business well into the future that would, I would sort of try and appeal to that good sense in any of my creditors. The second would be to go back onto the relationship. If you have built a good relationship, you've been a good payer, there have been other benefits, intangible benefits of being associated with that brand. The one I can think of is where a creditor was able to give us a bit of a discount in exchange for a testimonial and some marketing exposure on our platforms. So I would then go back to essentially see how my relationship and my business benefits that particular vendor and see if there's a non-cash arrangement we could get into.
From my side, I was actually advising clients who are quite cash strapped the other day, who run an e-commerce site that are just starting out. And they're in the business of having to either stock up front a whole bunch of products from suppliers or try and find another means to satisfy the demand for their site. And as they're very new and they don't want to outlay massive cash flow, what we've tried to do, instead of negotiate or instead of having to pay for upfront stock, is to negotiate with suppliers drop shipping terms where only once an order, for example, comes in from a client on your side, do you in turn then need to order it from your supplier, which will obviously really secure them from a cash flow perspective and create massive liquidity and lower their risks. So if you are in a position to be able to do that would help.
That's actually very interesting. It doesn't get more variable than drop shipping. You have absolutely no fixed costs in that environment. So
no storage costs, no pre-order costs, no nothing.
Maybe for the benefit of some of our listeners, we should talk a little bit about what is drop shipping.
So dropshipping essentially, as I understand the term, is where, for example, you've got an e-commerce website, you've listed a product, let's say I've listed a bicycle on there for sale. I don't hold stock of that bicycle. It's ordered off my platform. And I then in turn order it from the bicycle manufacturer or whoever I order the bicycle from, who will then either fulfill delivery directly to the client or will deliver it to me and I'll in turn send it to the client. But I will not pay for that bicycle when it's listed on my site. I'll only pay for that bicycle once I receive funds from my client to the bicycle manufacturer. Unless I'm wrong. Alex, you probably have a good view on that.
Yeah, I mean, drop shipping, the way I know it is that you basically plug and play often into someone else's infrastructure, IT infrastructure. You place an order automatically. The order gets fulfilled completely by the third party, and you basically mainly own the client relationship, but you have nothing to do with the order fulfillment. That's
Europe. That's where things work. No, I'm joking.
No. They are. I think there are quite a few good drop shipping solutions also in South Africa.
Stop, Dropper. I think there are a couple.
But it is. It again here you're trading again variable cost for fixed costs. So at scale, does it make sense? That's a question that every entrepreneur needs to ask themselves. Is what's my competitive advantage? Where can I generate additional value, and is that worth it at scale, or is it only worth it to kind of get started, or in a pandemic? I think generally, if we go back to the variable cost topic, I mean, drop shipping is definitely one very interesting concept. But I think there are two more levers I think that needs to be discussed, or the two things that in order to create liquidity, there are two things I think an entrepreneur can do. And the one thing is to talk about a discount. Sid, that's what you've mentioned also before. the better the relationship, the more likely you might be able to get a discount. And second is payment terms. Is to negotiate the payment terms. Your client can't pay, now you can't pay. I mean, how often have you heard this now in the recent
on a daily basis?
Yeah. So I think here, I think it's quite interesting to when would you kind of do what? When would you kind of try to negotiate a discount, and when would you try to negotiate the payment terms?
That's actually very interesting. I find myself in the same predicament right now. I'm not sure if we have an answer, but from my perspective, I would say that it's a combination of the both of them. Now, if you have accounts that are currently owed and you are not being paid by your clients, and at the same time the prospect of future revenue is also diminished, you end up going into a bit of a debt spiral. You're not able to catch up. So you could have all the terms in the world, but as long as you're going to continue to use that supplier and rack up additional costs, you're going to find yourself in a position where you're not going to be able to pay what you owe or pay what you owe in the future, unless you're able to collect all that revenue. And now we're assuming a bit of bad debt. I would say that you would have to really, in this COVID-19 situation, go for heavy discounting and try and maintain payment terms, because that ultimately speaks a lot more to your credibility. So rather put a plan together that is achievable, but something that you do stick to.
Interesting. Well, from a legal perspective, Kyle, is there anything that, as my valued lawyer, you would prefer, discount or payment terms?
Definitely discount. Payment terms are just deferring the same payment. I mean, it's great for cash flow, but I think discount is a better long-term advantage. But often what we do, especially in landlord leasing situations, is we actually go in with both. We propose both. We try and fit in. The reality is, especially in commercial leases, you're not in a great position. As a residential lease, you can actually just cancel on 20 days notice in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, but it's very different for a commercial lease. So we often go to the landlord with both, saying, listen, this is our situation. We can't afford it. How about we defer rent for 3 months in addition to that? Or as an alternative, can we reduce the last 2 months' rent because we haven't had any occupation of the premises? But yeah, I'd prefer reduction and deferment.
Interesting. So, so my take on this is a little bit, it depends on the supplier. Generally, in my experiences, if your supplier has, high margins and has high liquidity need due to fixed costs, and they really want the payment right now, then probably they will give you a discount. And you will see that with a couple of, SaaS companies or software as a service companies that really kind of want you to stay on. And they're heavily discounting their products at this moment everywhere. IBM, everyone's giving like longer free trials and whatsoever. So I think in these type of supplies, I think negotiating discounts is really easy or relatively easy. And also the bigger the company, probably, it probably depends. Whereas,
good point you make. I think suppliers are far more willing to accept a reduction now than a deferment because they've got their own fixed and variable costs to cover.
100%. But I think if a supplier is in that predicament that they have to pay their suppliers, and they have relatively low margins, so that's when you go more into the manufacturing environment, I would say. Is someone who's operating on a 15% margin, is that person going to give you a huge discount? You can negotiate hard, but most likely, that oak is not going to give you a big discount. So the best you can ask for is a deferment of payment, in my opinion, because what is your supplier going to do? He's going to ask for his supplier for a deferment as well. And obviously that's not a very long-term sustainable solution, but I think that's the only way, that's kind of a common situation that the lockdown has created for a lot of businesses.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, is another way to look at this. The at the very least, the value of the discount, keeping payment terms in consideration, should be the amount that you would have otherwise earned in interest, or if you have a loan, should be equal to the amount you would have paid in interest payments, because money today is worth more than money tomorrow. So I think that's something vendors should take into consideration. The other point I'd like to make is that if you do find a vendor that gives you massive discounts because they have high margins, I'm sure after COVID-19 is over, you go back to them and say, well, you make too much money off of me anyway, so I'm not willing to pay you that anymore.
Well, that's a risk they have to take, I guess. But I think it's an interesting thing, because you are right that there is this interest element of it. But I think people are not really interested right now in having 8% interest on anything. At the end of the day, if they get their money at all, they are kind of happy.
Yeah.
I think that's the situation where a lot of people, in what situations people are in. How we haven't talked a lot about kind of how to approach it. I mean, Kyle, maybe I don't know if you've done it or if you've done it for some of your clients. When you negotiate a discount, let's say you want to get from one of the softwares that you use, a free video editing software or whatever, how would you negotiate that discount without referring to any contract?
Yeah, I think that you got to figure out whether or not you can reach out to them in any event. I wouldn't even bother trying to go to Google, for example, with my ads, or Facebook, because you're just never going to get through to anyone, and they've got more than enough business anyway. So you have to pick your battles at the end of the day. What I would do is I would approach companies that I've got a good relationship with first, which we've spoken about, because that's where you're most likely going to be able to get your discount. And then I would, if there's a legal basis for me to subtly justify why I don't need to pay that full amount, such as a landlord, I would subtly slip that in there to know that I am in a decent position to negotiate rather than being entirely on the back foot. So I'd pick my battles by who I can contact and what my legal position is first, and then I'd go out of desperation, things that I cannot afford, but I absolutely need, of which I don't have a basis to sort of argue, and then just go with my tail between my legs, and really say, listen, we've been going for so long, we're going to come out of this, we're all in this together, what can we work out? So yeah, that's generally how I would approach it.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, if I can add to what Kyle has said, I would also mention, that everyone has a liquidity issue. You're a part of that, and I would try to communicate constantly. When you're trying to negotiate any type of discount or payment terms, I think that honest, open, transparent communication is super helpful. And sometimes just asking for help and how can we figure this out together. Because you have been a good client, or you are a good client generally, can also just really help.
Kyle, I have a question for you. In these circumstances, I've heard the words undue hardship be thrown around. What is the concept of undue hardship from a legal point of view, and how can one use that as a negotiating chip?
Undue hardship from a contractual perspective isn't really going to help you much. It's not really a term that will help you get out of a contract. If undue hardship has resulted in your impossibility to perform, then you could rely on something called vis major, which is very similar to force majeure, but if the clause is not incorporated into the contract. And once again, it's this massive supervening external force that prevents you from performing. It's a lot harder to prove, and generally it's quite hard to get off of liability there, but undue hardship doesn't mean anything unless it results in an impossibility to perform from a contractual perspective.
And maybe before we stop here, Kyle, what's happening if you're not paying your bills? What can happen to you? So I mean, we've talked about referring to your contract. We've talked about just speaking to your supplier to extend payment terms or give a discount. but we haven't talked about what's happening if you're actually not paying.
Sure. Well, obviously, if you're not paying or you're not able to pay, try communicate that. Communication is better than nothing. I've got a lot of clients which have just remained absolutely silent. And then as soon as you actually engage with whoever's trying to recover from you and you communicate, it makes it a lot more bearable, because otherwise you're just keeping the supplier guessing. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. What was your question again?
The question was, what happens if you're not paying one of your suppliers?
Yeah. So
from the point of view.
In terms of a contract, if there are invoices owing, you can be referred to debt collectors, i.e. lawyers who will eventually end up suing you for the money. You can be referred to or listed on credit bureau debtor lists, which means that if, for example, you apply for vehicle finance or house finance later on down the line, you'll come up as a red flag and you might well not get that finance. There might be court proceedings. So it's not great generally, unless there's an avenue out in terms of the contract, where if you're not paying and you can rely on a force majeure clause, or if you're not paying but you can rely on a certain cancellation clause, for example, to get out of the agreement. But generally that's what will result if there's no way out and you aren't paying.
So if someone is telling you, I'm going to hand you over to the ombudsman, what does that mean?
Well, not the ombudsman. The ombudsman sort of decides between disputes. It might be a credit bureau, or most likely will be debt collectors that they're referring to. So I hand you over to a law firm, or I just list you as a bad creditor in one of our many credit bureaus around the world.
Okay. So you would really try to avoid that in order to not damage your company in the long run, basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you do get a judgment against you, they can execute against your property, meaning they could come in and repossess any of your business assets to try to satisfy it or pay back that debt.
What if you set up as or your entity as a limited liability company? Can they go after you personally?
No, generally not, unless you've breached your fiduciary duties. So that's one good thing. Unless you've stood surety, there are a lot of contracts with suppliers where you sign a materials contract and you have to, one of the directors stands as surety. So in that case, they could absolutely go after the surety in their personal capacity.
Well, that's why they say never sign a surety.
No, definitely not. Absolutely not.
Defeats the purpose of being a LLC.
In some instances, it's very hard to avoid, such as commercial leases, etc. It is really hard.
True. Gentlemen, I think that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you for your participation, and we will see you again next week.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kyle, for joining us today and show from a legal point of view what are the impacts of reducing costs, creating liquidity, for our listeners and for all the small to medium-sized businesses that are currently, taking all the knocks in the world that and it's difficult to kind of stay positive.
Yeah, perfect, guys. Thank you very much for having me.